Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Ethical Society and its beautiful auditorium. My name is Charles Powell, and I'm happy to introduce Dr. Emmanuel Garcia, who will be speaking to you tonight about the early 20th century composer, Frederick Delius. He is joined in this celebration of Delius by the artist Marianne Barclay, who has created the paintings you see hanging on the stage, and the musicians Elena Jivaeva and Daniel Khalikov, who will be performing for us. After the program, which will include audience discussion, there will be a reception upstairs. I met Emmanuel about 30 years ago in Dublin when he was a student there. Our friendship was formed in our passion and love of music and literature, and we would spend many evenings in intense discussions, sometimes heated, involving composers, musicians, writers, opera singers, and so on. Recently, in fact, in the last few years, Emmanuel has lectured on subjects as diverse as Mahler and Freud, their 4-hour talk, Rachmaninoff and Scriabin, Talent v Genius, and now tonight's composer, Frederick Delius, sometimes fascinating, sometimes controversial, and even to this day, rather infrequently performed. If by the end of tonight's lecture you're not a convert, hopefully you will be. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Emmanuel Garcia.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. And as I was sitting here listening to my friend Charles' comments, I was reminded of many years ago when I was preparing to study for a microbiology exam. And as the hours got closer to the exam, I kept remembering, or kept discovering how much more I needed to know and didn't know, until finally I did in fact close the book, and I did take the exam. Well, it's time for me to sort of close the book for myself and open it for you. And I'd like to begin actually with music. There will be music at the end of our program. There will be live music in between. And my job is to supply the hot air that buffers the musical excerpts. So just to begin, in 1928, a young man by the name of Eric Fenby, living in the north of England in Scarborough, happened to be playing chess one evening with a friend. And this Fenby was a very musical person, very proficient, really an extraordinary musician, and mainly self-taught. Well, if my memory serves me correctly, as he was playing chess and about to be mated, 7 minutes of music were transmitted over the wireless, and these 7 minutes of music transformed his life and also transformed a piece of our musical history. So without further ado, I'm going to ask you to sit back and enjoy the 7 minutes of music that created this transformation. Well, I think Delius, if anything, teaches us patience. Can you lower that little microphone? Thanks. And I'm going to ask your patience tonight a little bit as well. Well, when the young Eric Fenby, who at this point was considering entering a Benedictine monastery, heard this music, and in probably considerably less fidelity than we've just heard it, he was so taken by the music, he was so overtaken by the music, that he spent several days wandering along the cliffs of Scarborough in the north of England, and he finally got up the gumption to write to the Deliuses, having learned of the plight of the composer, who by this time was paralyzed, ailing, despondent, and unable to do any composition whatsoever, and blind, if I didn't mention that. So Fenby wrote to the Deliuses, and they accepted his offer nearly instantaneously. This was one of those wonderful, lucky, fortunate accidents of fate. And over the next 6 years, until Delius' death, the young Fenby was able to devise, work, collaborate, and allow this ailing, despondent composer to extract what remained artistically within his breast. It is a poignant, beautiful, memorable story that needs telling and knowing and retelling, and hearing anew, because it raises some very interesting aspects of issues involving authorship, collaboration, the psychology of devotion, to which very little attention has been paid, and the human necessity to create in any stage, even in the stages of illness. Well, for me to give you the proper context, I'm going to have to step back and make some preliminary and biographical comments. Most of you have heard of the filmmaker Ken Russell. Well, Ken Russell made a very beautiful film about these last years of Delius, based on Fenby's classic memoir, Delius as I Knew Him. And the Russell who made this film was not the Russell of the Tchaikovsky film, or the Gauguin film, or Tommy, or the film about Mahler. Films of, if I may put it mildly, excess. No, this Russell film was a true masterpiece of its genre, one of the best films I've ever seen. And so when I saw this film, I thought immediately, what a wonderful thing to show to an audience. And yet, I thought, there's a problem with the film, and it goes beyond the limits of the film medium, which I can spend many hours talking about, which I'm sure you don't want to hear. But it has to do with the picture of Delius that's created. The Delius in the film is a Delius who is ailing, blind, paralyzed. He's a cantankerous kind of crotchety tyrant. And in fact, he was like this much of the time in his last years. But this is not the all of Delius. If this picture is the only picture we have of Delius, I think it is an incorrect one. Delius was a person who had a life before these last years, and to appreciate his struggle in those last years, we must make some biographical excursions. But before I do that, I want to make some preliminary comments. I want to welcome you all tonight. It's really a pleasure to be here. This is a marvelous hall, and I'm so glad to see all of you, many of whom are friends, and those who are not, welcome. I want to let you know that the artist who created these paintings you see hanging on the stage in response to the music of Delius and expressly for this program, Marianne Bartley, is not here. Her brother, who was getting ready to escort her to the program, had a heart attack, but I understand he's in good condition and he's being now taken to his hospital in North Carolina. Marianne is someone who has dedicated her life to eliciting the creative impulse in people of all walks of life. Businessmen, physicians, medical students, the homeless, everything in between, you name it. She's taught them, and she herself has been a working artist for many years. And very recently, she was awarded the prestigious honorary fellowship in the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. And she takes her place among Nobel Prize winners and other wonderful people. I'd also like to introduce Elena Jivaeva, a staff pianist at the Curtis Institute of Music. Elena is a graduate of the Uspensky School of Music and the Tashkent Conservatory in Uzbekistan. I worked with Elena before. She's a marvelous musician. She also is a dedicated teacher of little people, if I'm not mistaken. Daniel Khalikov, I am happy to introduce an extraordinary, brilliant young violinist. He's a student of Pinchas Zuckerman. He has already won several major competitions in the United States and in Europe. His work is it should be performed much more often. I think the Philadelphia Orchestra performed one piece of his last year. The year before, I think they performed nothing of his. And when they performed his piece last year, they lumped it in with the program on, of course, English music, which would have infuriated Delius, who didn't consider himself an English composer. You know, Elgar and Vaughan Williams, et cetera, et cetera. This brings to my mind the story by one of Delius's favorite authors, Mark Twain, a story about Captain Stormfield. And in this story, Captain Stormfield, who visits heaven from this very small, insignificant planet Earth, is brought to see a parade of all the greatest artists, all the greatest writers in the history of the planet Earth. And so his angel, his accompanying angel, takes him, and they're watching the parade. And Stormfield espies at the very head of the procession this person he'd never seen before, and he was wondering, well, who could this be? And behind this person leading the parade was Shakespeare, and then there was Dante and Virgil and Milton, and the whole train of people whom we know very well. Whereupon the angel responds to Stormfield and says, "Why, that's Billings of Tennessee." And Stormfield says, "Well, I've never heard of Billings." And the angel said, "Well, unfortunately, although he was the creator of the greatest works of drama, poetry, and literature in the history of your planet, his works were never published, and his neighbors hounded him to no end, and he died an unknown. But here, where justice prevails, he is considered the absolute preeminent creator in your planet." Well, there's a great deal of truth here. I think that with respect to Delius, we have an example of someone who, whether he is known to us or not, and he is known to us mainly because of a great deal of his own hard work and a lot of lucky accidents of fate that have brought forward devotees of a high order, like Fenby and like some others I will be discussing. He's known to us because of that, but he would have continued along his line of work no matter what, whether they were published, unpublished, played, or unplayed. He was an absolute exemplar of a dedicated artist, and that is one of the reasons I feel so compelled to bring his name to your attention tonight. I'm going to have to make a few comments about biography. I am not a particular fan of biography, least of all psychobiography. For one, biographies of the great artists, basically when they're good, they tell us a little bit about the times and places where these artists have resided. They tell us absolutely nothing about what is most important, namely that brilliant creative imagination that seizes something and brings it to fruition in a musical or literary or artistic way. This is the irreducible ineffability of creative genius. And I don't think we'll ever know much about those wonderful, inspired moments. Well, even though biographies pretend to tell us about these things, they really don't. When it comes to psychobiography, which is a particularly repellent form of biography, if you've worked with patients, or if you know anything about being a patient, et cetera, you know how difficult it is to learn the truth, seeing someone day in and day out over years and years and years. My friend Charles made an error of fact already. He said that he met me when I was a student in Dublin. I was not a student in Dublin. He met me when I was a student in the United States, traveling overseas in the summertime in Dublin. I later became a student in Dublin. So already we see the pitfalls of biography. It's very difficult. I'm very sorry, Charles. There's another species of biography known as hagiography, and hagiography comes from the Greek word hagios, meaning holy. And what typically happens is that biographers tend to fall so in love with their subjects that they create out of them saints, so that everything they've written, everything they've done is absolute perfection, not only the work, but the actual personality. No matter what the person does, that was in the service of the art. That was wonderful. That is just another example of this, that, the other. What often happens is that a critic or a student will respond to a particular work and seek to transfer that feeling about that work onto the entire whole person. And this, to my mind, is really a form of murder. Because what it does is it takes a human being, and by insisting on this absolute perfection of everything about the life, renders that human being inhuman. It's a form of murder. And very often you'll find that people who are absolute idolaters turn on a dime and they hate the former object of their devotion. That's very common, and those in analysis know all about this. So I'm not here as a Delius hagiographer, and I will tell you, There is a lot of Delius's music that leaves me unmoved. But there is some of Delius's music that I think is absolutely the most exquisite music to grace the human ear. Delius at his best, and he is not always at his best, but who among us is phenomenal. I should also let you know a little bit about opinions. Now, you may or may not have observed that musical people can be very opinionated. I think operatic people even more so. Well, I have my own opinions, and you're going to hear them. And I'm going to tell you right off that I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Scriabinist, and that I count it one of the great discoveries of my late middle age, as I was doing some research on Rachmaninoff and his First Symphony, to have discovered, wholly unknown to me, the music of this great genius. And it is a pleasure that I indulge in on a daily basis. And in fact, I see quite a number of parallels between Scriabin and Delius. Both were extraordinarily original people, artists, extraordinarily stubborn people who fought against whatever prevailing winds there were in taste or art, and both were true visionaries. And I hope to bring some of that to you tonight. Okay, so let me, having said that, talk a little bit about the life of Delius. But before I do so, I'm reminded of a parable of Voltaire. Oh, no, let me backtrack a little bit, because there is this Latin saying, de gustibus non est disputandum. Well, loosely translated, it means, if you're stupid enough to have an opinion different from mine, you ought to be shot. I think a classical scholar might translate it a little more carefully and say, about matters of taste, there is no argument. Well, again, it's another one of these aphorisms that's half true and half false, because about matters of taste, there are the most delightful arguments. And I can think of some of the most wonderful times I've had arguing with Charles, being at the Victor Cafe and arguing over whether Gigli or Björling were the greater tenor and playing aria after aria head to head until the wee hours of the morning. This is fun. We were all enlightened by that. What is not fun is arguing about fact. I mean, a fact's a fact. What can you do about it? It's like a country border. That's it. So you're going to hear some of these opinions from me. But the parable of Voltaire about biography that I'm reminded of, a Persian monarch, when he was a young man, once acceded to the throne, and he decided he was going to be better than his father. He was going to be the wisest ruler who ever ruled. And therefore he sent all the scribes of the realm, and he gave them the charge to provide him with a history of human existence, so he could be the best and most wise ruler. Well, they went away for 10 years, and they worked and they toiled, and they came back 10 years later, and they had 100 camels piled high with hundreds of scrolls, and he was in the midst of the campaign at this point, and he said, I'm a little busy right now, you'll have to condense this, I can't really get through all this material. So he sent them away. They came back 10 years later with 50 camels and 50 scrolls in each. Again, these emperors are always battling something or other. He was in another campaign, and again he told them to condense, and so on, until finally in his 9th decade, as he's on his deathbed and he's waging yet another victorious battle, the last remaining scribe comes to him and gives him the essential summary of all human wisdom. And he says, man is born, he suffers, and he dies. Whereupon the monarch expires with a smile on his face. Well, about Delius, I think we can say he was born, he suffered, he had a tremendous amount of pleasure in his life, and he wrote an awful lot of music that has given many, many people a great deal of pleasure. And I'm going to go into some of the biographical details of Delius. Frederick Delius was born in 1862 in Yorkshire, the north of England, in Bradford. His father, a German, was a successful wool merchant and described by Delius' sister Claire to be an absolute tyrant. She actually called him a Hitler. Very strong words indeed in the household. Delius' mother was a rather cool person. Delius was the fourth of 14 children. Now I say any woman who can give birth to 14 children and raise them can do just about anything else she wants. And that is really a superhuman effort. But Delius had this to say. At one point he wrote in his letters that she was the falsest of women. And then I'm going to quote from something else of his. In his last years with Fenby, he says, when he hears of his mother's death, he says, a strange woman. She never took the slightest interest in my music after I left Bradford as a young man. I very much doubt if she ever heard a note of mine played, and after my music began to be played, she made no inquiries about it. She never met Jelke, Delius's wife. She never wrote. And once when I tried, in her late 80s, when she was flying to Cologne and I could still get about, I went to Cologne especially to meet her, but she never turned up. There was no explanation. A strange woman. Go on reading, Eric. Well, this was the Delius parental household. Delius, as a child himself, was no hothouse flower. Although musically talented, he was an athletic young boy, a prankster. He was extremely vigorous. He developed a tremendous love of nature. He became proficient enough on the violin later in his life to be able to play at least the third movement of the Mendelssohn Concerto. And he also played piano and learned piano. And through his home, his father, being a rich merchant, would have some of the greatest musicians of the day pass, such as Joachim. So Delius was exposed to a lot of wonderful stuff. He says that the composer who made a tremendous musical impression upon him at the time was Chopin through his posthumous valse. Well, the father wanted Delius to continue in the family wool business. And Delius did for a little while, and he was a man of great charm and apparently great appeal to the opposite sex. But this is something he really did not want to do. He would not toe the line. And so he was able to sort of influence his father to purchase land in Jacksonville, Florida, of all places, for the purpose of cultivating oranges. And at the age of 22, Delius and a friend, a kind of a conspirator, I suppose, went to a place called Solano Grove near Jacksonville, Florida. Well, this for Delius was like the voyage of the Beagle for Darwin, or the self-analysis for Freud, or the trip to Tahiti for Gauguin. This was one of those momentous journeys that opens up the world and sets one on an irrevocably productive creative course. Delius, the son of a rather well-to-do family, was face-to-face with people who had only recently been enslaved. While at Solano Grove, he didn't do much about orange growing, believe me. He cared not a whit about that. But he was entranced by the magnificent physical scenery. He was entranced by the subtle and wondrous harmonies that he heard the African Americans singing and improvising. And very likely, he fell in love and had the great first romantic love affair of his life with an African American by the name of Chloe. And I'm going to talk about that later, and I'll refer to that a bit later in my talk, since it raised some very interesting questions. In any case, the other thing that happened in Florida was that he met an organist from Brooklyn, of all places, by the name of Thomas Ward. And Ward must have divined something very special in Delius, for Ward took it upon himself to teach Delius the fundamentals of music, of harmony, and of technique. And Delius forever would say that this was the absolute best instruction he ever had. It was Ward who eventually convinced Delius that he had to go to the greatest conservatory in Europe at the time, in Leipzig. And Delius did follow his advice, but not before he made a stop in Danville. But I also want to quote Delius's own words about Florida. I was demoralized when I left Bradford for Florida. You have no idea of the state of my mind in those days. In Florida, through sitting and gazing in nature, I gradually learned the way in which I should eventually find myself. But it was not until years after I had settled at Grès, a town in France, that I really found myself. Nobody could help me. Contemplation, like composition, cannot be taught. Well, Delius went to Leipzig via Danville. In Danville, he was given the title, interestingly enough, Professor of Music. And he taught a bevy of local beauties, the daughters of rich merchants in Danville, and apparently was very appealing to them, and finally made his way to Leipzig with the help of the family. Leipzig, the conservatory, was in decline at the time, and Delius cut a lot of classes. There's evidence that he actually attended to more of the instruction than he lets on, but nonetheless, he spent most of his time in Leipzig composing. He was an indefatigable worker, and also being exposed to the greatest of European music at the time. Tchaikovsky passed through Leipzig, Brahms, Mahler, Arthur Nikisch, and I suppose most importantly of all for Delius, Edvard Grieg, a Norwegian composer. Now Grieg gave Delius two wonderful gifts, aside from the gifts of his music. Grieg wrote and met with Julius Delius, the father, and convinced the father that Delius had the stuff, that he should be encouraged and supported in his musical quest. And his father complied and provided a stipend. He also, maybe more importantly, gave the following advice to Delius himself, advice that I think cannot be better for an artist, a true artist. He said, "If you will permit me, in the interest of your future, to offer you a piece of advice, it would be this: devote yourself now, while you are still young, fully to the pursuit of your art, rather than accept a formal position, and that you follow both your own true nature and the inner voice of your ideals and your inclinations." Well, Delius did exactly that. He followed his own true voice and inclinations, absolutely to the T. After Leipzig, he settled in Paris, if settle is quite the word. Now, those of you who are familiar with the Paris of Balzac and Hugo and Anatole France and Guy de Maupassant, well, you know that Paris was a place of teeming artistic energy. And Delius had his world opened even further for him. Not so much by musicians. He didn't like to hang around musicians, least of all composers who only spoke about technique. Delius was not interested in technique for technique's sake. But he did make friends with some of the artistic luminaries of the 20th century. People like August Strindberg, Henrik Ibsen, the painters Edvard Munch, Henri Rousseau, and perhaps most importantly for him, Gauguin. Delius was also became an habitué of the Parisian demi-monde, and he availed himself of the sexual liberties there. And he also he reports too that for a while he would attend sessions at the morgue to again get a sense of life and death in its fullest. But with respect to Gauguin, I think that in a way Delius was a little bit in love with the man. Not the man in the flesh so much, but the stockbroker turned adventurous artist, which Gauguin was. We believe that he shared Gauguin's mistress, Anna, and we also believe that it was from Anna that Delius contracted syphilis, which would play such a large role in his life. Well, having said all that, however, Delius was one, as a self-professed artist, not to devote his artistic energies in Paris to divining the appropriate angle of his beret at a fashionable West Bank cafe. Delius really composed. He consistently worked. He also had a chance to meet a person who would become his helpmeet, his savior, his saint, and spiritual soulmate. And this was Jelke Rosen, who would become his wife. Well, let me give you, she in fact is a devotee, and I want to talk about the effect that Delius, the artist, made upon her. It's interesting. If you look at the Delian letters, there's not really a romantic word exchange between Jelke and Delius. And there's evidence that the marriage itself, when it came about, was never even consummated, in part because Delius did not want to contaminate her with syphilis, and also because there was probably not a physical attraction on his part to her. But this is what she had to say about his art. She says, "The greatest yearning of humanity was expressed so beautifully, and I was overcome with the wonder of it all, that Fred, Delius, was so gifted and had all his life before him to create such beautiful things. I resolved to give him all help and assistance in my power." And that is exactly what she did to the end of his life and beyond. She was a marvelous person. Well, before they were formally married in 1903, Delius made a return trip to Florida. And I think this trip was motivated by several things. There was a business angle to it, no doubt. He wanted to try to eke some kind of income from the Floridian estate. And as Tasman Little, the British violin virtuoso, points out in a very interesting piece of work, which I will delve into in more detail later on, he may very well have been returning to seek, again, the company of his first love and the child that he fathered. we'll talk more about the ramifications of the great first love in the life of the artist. In any case, when he returned from Florida, by the way, I should mention, on the trip to Florida, when he took his boat, his ship, a society woman disguised herself as a man in order to gain entry so she could have the company of Delius. He was quite a roue, Delius. He returned from Florida, and in the meantime, Jelke had purchased a little home in this beautiful hamlet about 60 miles southeast of Paris called Grès-sur-Loing. And Grès was the place where Delius received or imbibed the tranquility and beauty of nature and the resolve to compose the works of his I think his greatest masterpieces, or masterpieces that most people agree upon. Things such as the ending, finishing Romeo and Juliet, Sea Drift, Mass of Life, Greek Fair, and I think Songs of Sunset at the same time, between 1900 and 1910. The marriage was really more of a spiritual and artistic union. They were both avid Nietzscheans in the sense that they celebrated the spirit of independent creativity. Occasionally, after bouts of composition, Delius would run off to Paris and go to the brothels, and Jelke was not particularly happy about that, as you could understand, and they would have rows about this. On one occasion, usually civil Delius actually used the B word in an argument with Jelke. And since there are no members of the Vice Squad here, I can repeat it. He called her a bourgeois. This sent her flying into the garden in tears. This is the worst thing that someone like Jelke could hear about herself. She herself was a painter of considerable talent, but she realized in what Delius was doing that he was able to articulate a vision which transcended and included her. And that was the basis for her devotion. Well, in 1910, another bright spot comes along when Thomas Beecham, this brilliant young British conductor, happens to be listening to a performance of works, and here's this new strange work, Appalachia, or Appalachia as he would say, conducted by Garcia. I'm not so sure it was the greatest performance, but Beecham, when he heard that performance of Delius's music, was transfixed, and from that day on, he became certainly the greatest musical champion of Delius, I think, the greatest interpreter of Delius. For almost every concert he gave, he would program one of Delius's works. He was an absolute devoted champion, and he was, again, one of these wonderful, fortunate accidents of fate that befell Delius. And if it were not for Beecham, I doubt that any of us would know about Delius. I think he'd be buried in the annals, and it would be up to a very small part of the Delius Society to play these recordings or know about these scores. Beecham did tremendous service to Delius. And, I should add, someone asked him about their friendship that they had. And Beecham said, well, we really have nothing else in common except his music. We disagree on politics, we disagree on other composers, we disagree on everything else, but about his music we agree. And Delius, in fact, when he would hear Beecham perform his music, would say, that's just the way I want to hear it. So that was a bright spot. Beecham did note that 1910 seemed to mark a turning point in the personality of Delius. Now remember, Delius was kind of a prankster, jokester, very suave, extremely charming. In 1910, Beecham noted that he had become hard and kind of cranky and cantankerous and not playful. Something was happening. And he attributed it to the fact that Delius, for the first time, had to make his own living. Well, that's not really true. For one, Jelke had been supporting Delius anyway. She bought the home. Secondly, his compositions were earning some royalties. What really happened was that Delius was diagnosed with tertiary syphilis. Now, I don't know if we can appreciate this now, in this day and age, what tertiary syphilis meant. It meant a life to a vigorous young man, a vigorous man as he was. He would tramp about the fjords of Norway and the mountains of Europe. Beecham could hardly catch up with him when they were tramping about. He was many years his junior. This meant a life of ever-diminishing functioning, a life of pain, a life where death could come suddenly, and a life where he could be so helpless. I can't quite describe it. I guess when HIV first made its presence felt before the drugs that are available in developed countries, something similar occurred. Syphilis was a scourge. And let me read you the diagnosis that was offered to give evidence that in 1910 the diagnosis was made. He went to a sanatorium, and Dr. Bote writes, about 1 year ago, he, Delius, collapsed. That is, there was a noticeable loss of strength. About the same time, other pains occurred. Arms, shoulders, and in the area of the thorax, toes, repeated gastric crises, uneven yet reacting pupils, and indeed increased knee reflexes. Reduced feeling of pain in the lower extremities. On the upper left thigh, a tertiary syphilid, Wassermann positive. Well, this is 1910. Ehrlich has just begun the arsenical treatment of syphilis with the salvarsan, which would have done him no good, absolutely, as far as we know anyway. And Delius pursued a number of homeopathic cures. But the next number of years were an ever worsening spiral of pain and loss of function. And Delius, who knew Ibsen fairly well and would know his play Ghosts, I think this captures something of what Delius had to face. This is Oswald Alving in the third act of Gibson's Ghosts. Oswald says to his mother, "It, the illness, lies here waiting, and any time, any moment, it may break out. I had one attack while I was abroad. It passed off quickly, but when I learnt the condition I had been in, then this dreadful, haunting fear took possession of me. Yes, it is so indescribably horrible, you know. If only it had been an ordinary mortal disease. I am not so much afraid of dying, but this is so appallingly horrible. To become like a helpless child again, to have to be fed, to have to be, it's unspeakable. I dare not think what it would mean to linger and lie like that for years. To get old and gray, because it doesn't necessarily have a fatal end quickly, the doctor said. He called it a kind of softening of the brain." And the play ends with the motionless Oswald saying the words, "The sun, the sun." Well, by 1917, Delius could hardly walk. By 1921, both of his hands were paralyzed. By 1925, he was totally blind. Nonetheless, somehow he managed to compose. In fact, he completed the Requiem in 1916. He completed the cello sonata. He completed something else which escapes my memory at the moment. He began new compositions. During that time, the cello concerto, I think, was begun. The music to Hassan was begun and finished. And the violin concerto also, that was finished in that period of time. And how he managed to dictate to Jelke, who had no formal musical training, is itself an amazing mystery about which we know nothing. We know absolutely nothing. And that's a mystery I don't know if we can ever discover at some point. So this brings us to 1925. When he became blind, the years 1925 to 28 were marked by no production whatsoever. He was really helpless. He was really invalid. Jelke was despondent. None of the friends who had passed through could help him. Percy Granger, Philip Heseltine, whatsoever, Balford Gardner. They could be of no help. And this, 1928, Fenby, the young person about to go off to a monastery, happened to chance upon this beautiful music and offer services. And he was welcomed with open arms. And thus began this magnificent collaboration. Now, this was not an easy collaboration, and Fenby had a hard time of it. This young boy, a devout Roman Catholic in the household of two raging atheists, a young boy who happened to have the musical gifts to be able to help, but Delius, the whole household in Delius's home revolved around Delius. When they ate, Jelke would engage manservants to carry Delius up and down to give him some exercise. They'd brush the flies off his face. They would read to him at nighttime when he woke in pain. And they read a lot of Mark Twain and Walt Whitman, apparently. In any case, Fenby eventually, with Delius, devised this magnificent collaborative way of getting Delius to extract music. And his memoir is a classic, and it's quite beautiful. And Fenby had a nervous breakdown, about which not much is known in the course of the work with Delius to the end. But let me play, in Fendi's own words, what Fendi had to say about the very first attempt when Delius came down to dictate music to him. So if you would play that, please. Track 2.
One evening after supper, Delius surprised me by saying that he had an idea in his mind, a simple little tune, and that he wanted me to take it down. I took paper and pen and waited eagerly. I had no idea whatever what he would do, whether he would sing or call out the names of the notes and their varying time values. What he did was to stagger and confound me so utterly that I did not recover for the rest of that night. Throwing his head back, he began to drawl in a loud monotone that was little more than the crudest extension of speech, and which, when there was anything of a ring about it, wavered round a tenor middle beat. And this is something like what I heard. Ta-ta-ta, ta-ta-ta, ta-ta-ta. And here he interjected, hold it, and then went on, ta-ta-ta-ta-ta. Ta-ta-ta-ta, hold it. Ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta, hold it. Ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta, hold it again. Ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta. Well, when Delius had finished this amazing recital, he turned to me and asked, have you got that? Now sing it. I was dumbfounded. But dear, as I stammered, what key is it in? A minor, came the answer. And in a flash, I saw that he evidently heard the tune imaginatively, but was unable to sing it. Well, we'll try again, he went on. And there was more suggestion of disgust and impatience in his tone than I cared to admit. It was obvious that he failed to understand how I could be so stupid. And when I suggested that it would help if he would call out the names of the notes, he gave a great sigh and added, oh, well, all right then. And the drawing began again. But now on another note. A, B, C, B, D, E, and well, I quickly sketched the shape of this melody, but had no idea of the stresses, nor even the time signature. I was too flurried, too nervous, far too upset to go about it in the proper way. I had not thought that it would be anything like this, and the sting of my emotion pierced me to the heart. My pen flopped about in my fingers, and in my confusion I found myself holding it upside down. My fingers were inky, and the tears that I had been fighting to keep back now blurred my spectacles. I couldn't see. And the more I looked at this relic of a man and heard his hopeless attempts to make himself understood in but the rudiments of the glorious art in which he so correctly excelled, the more distressed I became. In the end, the sight and sound of it were too much for me, and I broke down. I had to give it up. And just then, Mrs. Delius entered the room, and I pulled myself together as best I could and said, I'm sorry, I can't go. Please excuse me. I got up and went out into the porch, and as I groped my way in pitch darkness round to the door which led up from the garden to the music room, I overheard Delius say to his wife, Jelke, that boy is no good. He's too slow. He cannot even take down a simple melody. I slept very little that night, for now it seemed that my mission was a complete fiasco. There was only one consolation, and that was in the thought that nobody on earth could have made head or tail of those faltering sounds. However, this melody, transposed into G minor, is now to be heard in the second movement of Delius's third sonata for violin and piano.
Well, without further ado, I'm going to welcome Elena Jivaeva and Daniel Khalikov to play the fruit of that dictation, the third sonata for violin and piano. Mind you, it is a sonata for two instruments, not just the violin. outside if people need water. We can bring in the glass. Daniel Khalikov. Well, we're in the home stretch. I want to make a few comments about Delius' music in general, after which I'll discuss the impact of the illness, and then the matters of devotion and collaboration. And we'll have time for an audience discussion, and hopefully it will be a lively one, and a surprise encore as well. I have no idea what they're going to play, so we'll all be surprised. I'm sure whatever they do will be beautiful. This piece ended quietly. Almost everything Delius wrote ended quietly, and it's quite anomalous in the history of classical music. About the music, I can say a few things, although it's somewhat fatuous to talk about an art form that really transcends words, with words. But there's a sense of what I've called before, that I've sensed in Scriabin, something I've called the genuine, a way that a composer at his best is able to pierce right into the heart of the human condition and articulate it for us. I don't know that many can achieve it. When they do achieve it, it's something spectacular. I suppose in this regard, a comment by G.B. Shaw is apt. He says, "The great artist, by supplying works of a higher beauty and a higher interest than have yet been perceived, succeeds, after a brief struggle with its strangeness, in adding this fresh extension of sense to the heritage of the race." I think this idea of the genuine, to my mind, is adding this fresh extension of sense somehow. Secondly, the music, there's the humility about Delius's approach to music. He doesn't try to mimic nature or claim he creates nature instead of nature, but he sees something and manifests it for us in his own unique, palpable language. There's also a tremendous sensuousness about almost everything he composed. It's as if Delius was not afraid to show nature in all of its naked beauteousness. And this really leads me to discuss a little bit this wonderful hypothesis of Tasman Little, whose mother, Jilly Little, is in the audience tonight. I'd like to thank her for what she's done to help me to prepare for tonight, and to thank her for coming all the way from London to hear about Delius. In any case, Tasman Little, while playing the violin concerto, noticed a profound sense of loss and longing, and she was intrigued by this, and she saw this element in works of Delius that had appeared at a certain point. And she had remembered or researched Delius some more and come across a comment of Percy Granger about Chloe, the African-American mistress, and confirmed the fact, and confirmed from Eric Fenby, no less, that Delius had indeed fathered a child, and did some wonderful investigative work. And there's a documentary from the BBC called The Lost Child, which I would all highly recommend to you. Whether or not it is literally true, I think she has hit on a really important psychological truth about the effect of this first great romantic love in the life of the artist. We see it all the time in all the great artists. I think we see it in almost everybody, that this first love is an impossible love. It's inevitably doomed. It has energies that belong to the parents, which is why it has to fail. And it is really the subterranean message of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, that these all-encompassing, all-transforming, all-complete loves can't really exist in the real world. And certainly Delius did not have this with Jelke. He had this more practical, spiritual union that made for what he achieved. And with Chloe, well, we'll never know, but I do think we hear this sense of loss and yearning, and it may relate back to his mother, the mother who brought forth so many children almost continuously, and was a very cool person, perhaps not so available to him as he would have liked. Well, what mother is for anybody, let's face it. And with respect to the element of this longing, I'm going to ask Elena and Daniel to play the second movement again in a few minutes. Because I think this was the supreme achievement of those years of collaboration with Svenby. Some would disagree, would say that the Song of Summer or Songs of Farewell were, but I think Delius, despite the constraints of the sonata form, was able to achieve an apotheosis of sorts of what he really wanted to express. But I'd also like to say a few more things too about the music. There is a a profound sense of the contemplative in his music. Delius is nothing if not contemplative. All of us have had experience using a microscope, and you know how we start with a high power and we see the terrain of the cell, and then we gradually increase it, and the structures become more fine and more detailed, and we increase it again and again. This is what Delius in his contemplation does for us in a way. He doesn't repeat himself. He brings us more intensely, he brings us more deeply into the subject matter at hand. And we are lucky that we have Delius' own words about his own music. Delius was not a particularly articulate person. When he wrote sometimes in a polyglot of Norwegian, German, and English, and he was not a very eloquent person with words. He left that to his music. But he said this about his requiem. He said, "Often a man is judged worthless to the world and its laws, who should be exalted by praise for his human grandness and the love of which he gives freely. Thus, independence and self-reliance are the marks of a man who is great and free. He will look forward to his death with high courage in his soul, in profound solitude, in harmony with nature, in the ever-recurrent, sonorous rhythm of birth and death." Freud once wrote a small paper called On Transience. It's really a prose poem. And in this paper, he describes walking in the springtime at the height of the flowering of the buds and trees and nature and all that, with a taciturn friend and a poet. The poet, and they were relishing the beauty, but the poet was so despondent because he said, by the time winter comes, all of this will be dead, it will be gone, and this beauty we're seeing inevitably comes to an end. Well, this is the essence of Delius' music. He celebrates both the joy, the magnificence, the beauty of nature, simultaneously with the understanding that it will decay and deteriorate and die, and he accepts it. And that's the story of our village Romeo and Juliet, where the two lovers die in the vastness of nature. Well, I would like to call Elena and Daniel back up to the stage to play and inculcate in us the sense of yearning and longing once more, the second movement of the Violin Sonata number 3. be able to break for an audience discussion. I just have a few more things to say. Firstly, I want to talk about the effects of syphilis, Delius. Now, in every account of the last years of Delius, almost like a tick, one reads that Delius's mental faculties were somehow miraculously spared, that Delius was as sharp as ever, that Delius was this. And quite frankly, a man who's had tertiary syphilis for all those years, syphilis being a systemic, generalized disease, who's been already blind from it, a disease characterized by infarction, by infection of the meninges and the vasculature, etc. There is no way that he could have been cognitively so completely spared. Now, mind you, I don't like to use the word dementia, but dementias are often hard to detect in ordinary folk like us, and it takes an awful lot of decrement to be noticed, even by a physician. There's a lot of funny stuff that goes on in Delius's last years. His mood swings were dramatic. He would become tremendously irritable, irrational, very paranoid. I suspect he had some perceptual disturbances that were quite well concealed. And this, before the Delians rise up in arms against me, this only makes what he did even more heroic, because what he accomplished with Fenby under the burden of that kind of an illness, when lesser people would have been converted to different religions or whatever, is absolutely heroic. He stood true and fast to the end, and when he had nothing else left to say, he told Fenby, and he expired shortly thereafter. And Jelke followed, I think, about a year after that. Well, about the nature of the collaboration, dictation. Some people have raised the idea that there's more Fenby and the Delius-Fenby legacy than Delius. There's a funny story when a neighbor questions Delius about this, and Delius turns on him and doesn't talk to Fenby for, I think, 6 months or so, because he thinks Fenby said something like that. Well, my interpretation of this marvelous, miraculous collaboration is that it was really a kind of rhapsody à deux. It was two people meeting in a form of rhapsody where authorial priority is moot. It's irrelevant. Fenby was Delius. Fenby was the Delius of the previous compositions which he had so imbibed and imbued himself with and studied. Now imagine, Delius would say a note or give Fenby a note, Fenby would play the note, he would extend it, he would play some chords, Delius would assent, he would lead Delius on, or Delius would dissent. It was a complicated procedure. The examples he gives in his book are anomalous. There are two of the clearest examples where Delius really knew exactly what he wanted, but these were very anomalous. In fact, if we look back a little bit, there is a precedent for Delius allowing someone to write something for him. Percy Granger anonymously wrote a dance to be incorporated into the Hassan music. When Fenby first came to Delius, Delius set him the task of taking the music of a poem of life and love and making something good out of it. So already Fenby was kind of a composer, a Delian composer, as it were. And here is what Delius says about the dictation. He says, an account of what happened when he, Delius, felt moved to compose without premeditation, as it were, would be unreadable. Very complicated thing. Writing music under the best of circumstances is extraordinarily complex. When you're blind and paralyzed and whatever, it's astronomically complex. Fenby continues, it is true that during the course of work on a new composition, I thought myself into it about as much as did Delius himself. My dear boy, you finished my sentences for me, he used to say. Fenby goes on and says, it was no use remaining passive and merely taking down the notes. And furthermore, I had often noticed during working hours that a phrase that Delius was about to dictate had already occurred to me before he could name it. I was often writing out some passage as fast as I could when, like a flash, some phrase would come to mind and I would be amazed to hear Delius begin to dictate it. They were joined together in a beautiful union, and what they did is absolutely miraculous. And I think we owe them such a tremendous debt, both Fenby and Delius. And certainly this is Delius, and this is Fenby in Delius, and we're all the richer for it. Well, finally, the human mind has a tendency to want to make deities within it, and to think of the artist as the great creator who, to go along with the etymologic meaning of the word of poetry, creates out of nothing. Well, no creator creates out of nothing. Delius would not have succeeded had he not had a string of devotees like Thomas Ward, like Hans Heim, the German conductor, like Thomas Beecham, like Gauguin for that matter, like Fenby, and most of all, Jelke. Jelke stood with him from best to worst as an absolute wonderful devotee, and she is as much a part of the Delius legacy as anyone can be. Now it's true, it is the artist, the irreplaceable artist, unlike the scientist, whose creations, whose moments of inspiration are theirs and theirs alone, a unique individual act, and that really is irreducible. But without the collaborative web, without the support, the inspiration, the practical aid, and the love, the artist could not function or exist. So, in a way, this talk is itself a paean to the notion of collaboration, and it is also an attempt to take some of the stigma away from being a devotee. You know, we hear about devotees are considered passive, submissive, slavish. The true devotee is not devoted to individual's personality. That's not a real devotee. Fenby was devoted to his vision that Delius could create and make imminent for us. Delius himself was a devotee of that vision. There's an impersonality about it. This is the essence of the psychology of devotion. Beecham said once that Delius was a rock. Delius deserves more than our admiration. He deserves a true and deep and committed hearing. Thank you very much. We have some time for audience questions and comments, and we have some really expert Delius people here, so take advantage of them. And what we're going to do is we'll have 20, 25 minutes or so, or until we run out, and then Elena and Daniel are going to play a surprise encore for us, after which all of you are invited to a reception upstairs where there will actually be food and drink, and we will celebrate this celebration of Delius.
I was thinking that the other reason he was so successful was that his hearing was not as bad. That hearing was extremely important for him to produce.
You mean Delius' hearing?
Yes.
Yes, I think for the most part his hearing was fortunately spared. Now, interestingly enough, Delius did not have perfect pitch. A lot of great composers didn't. Fenby did have perfect pitch. You want to say something further about that? Any other comments?
What was the age difference between the two of them?
Well, Fenby was 22, I think, when he went to Delius. Delius at this time was 1928. He was born in 62.
38.
Yeah. He was, can someone who knows math, please help me out. 66, okay. He was 66. So there's a 40-year difference. Delius, interestingly enough, it's a good thing he was never a parent. He would not have made a great father. In fact, the closest he came to it was with Philip Heseltine, a.k.a. Peter Warlock, and Beecham really excoriates Delius in terms of the influence he had on Heseltine. Delius was involved in doing what he had a mission to do. Now, I see that Bob Fitzpatrick, the Dean of Curtis Institute here, is in the audience, and I promised I would quote something from him, and I'm going to quote it whether he likes it or not. I interviewed him one time about musical education, and I said, what advice would you give the student of classical music? And Bob's response was, question everything. This is what Delius did. He questioned everything, and he answered himself. Now, other questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
What was the title of the opening piece, and also, if I understood it correctly, the violin sonata was written with the help of Fenby, and when was that?
The title of the piece, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that. The orchestral piece we heard at Fenby, at converted Fenby, was on hearing the first Cuckoo of Spring, conducted by Beecham and the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra. The piece we heard tonight is the Sonata for Violin and Piano No. 3, and I think this was completed in 1930. After, of course, Fendi had helped Delius. The gentleman,
Yes, you said that he went against, I don't remember exactly what you said. You said something about him going against the constraints of sonata form. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
well, if you look at the Delian Oeuvre, you'll notice one glaring omission. Anyone want to care to ask? Some Delius person knows what he did not write. What did Delius? He wrote operas.
No symphonies.
No symphonies. He couldn't be constrained. His works were best when they took on their own organic form. I've reminded myself of something I left out, which is very important, which has to do with one of his early operas that was never performed until 1977. It was called The Magic Fountain. This, I believe, is the true psychological, creative response to the romantic affair with Chloe. In The Magic Fountain, a young Spaniard by the name of Solano, remember he went to Solano Grove? The young Spaniard is on a quest there, not for filthy lucre, but for the font of youth and wisdom. He falls in love with an Indian guide, Watawa. Well, make a long story short, he beckons to her to join him in what he believes to be the waters of youth and wisdom, which she knows to be the waters of death, yet she willingly sacrifices herself and dies, and he then dies upon her breast. That, I think, I have to at some point think about that, because that is the psychological truth to the Chloe affair, I believe. Now, I lost my train of thought. Yes, good gentleman. Go ahead, sir.
I want to make one observation and ask one question. You mentioned the Fendi legacy. You felt that the Sonata No. 3, the violin and piano was perhaps the apex of that collaboration. How do you feel about the Idyll, which was based on the opera Marbre Rouge? Supposedly it has a Paris background, but I always thought of it as having some Louis Missouri background. I've always seen the Mississippi and the arch and Whitman words. And I understand too that the manuscript was lost for a long time and finally found in something. How do you feel about that?
How do you feel about it? You like it?
Well, I have to think that that's perhaps the apex of collaboration.
Well, I think it's quite beautiful. It's hard to pick favorites. I know the songs of farewell, they're very beautiful. And speaking of which, these songs of sunset were set to the poems of Ernest Dowson. This again, Dowson was considered a decadent poet. I don't know why people like him were considered decadent, what that really means. But let me give you an example of the words to which Delius said his song. They are not long, the weeping and the laughter, love and desire and hate. I think they have no portion in us after we pass the gate. They are not long, the days of wine and roses. Out of a misty dream, our path emerges for a while, then closes within a dream. That's quintessential Delius. That's also the basis for a popular song and a movie and whatever, but that's quintessential Delius, I think, in spirit. Now, you had a question.
Yes. The question is, since he was allegedly proficient at piano and violin, why did he write so little piano music in your estimation?
Well, I think that he claimed that his piano technique was ruined by the conservatory. He had his own unique way of fingering, and he claimed they really did a job on him at Leipzig. I don't think he was, I think his piano concerto, certainly the least favorite of my works, and for a while, for him, the least favorite of his works. He revised it at one point to make it a little more showy so the pianist would play it, but I think he really came into disfavor. One will notice about his works generally, they're not virtuoso displays. It's not about technical display for Delius. It's about conveying something wonderful through this musical language. You heard, again, the violin concerto was not really often played. The sonatas are almost never played. Tasman Little is a wonderful pioneer in a way in championing the works of Delius, and we should all give her credit. She goes around the world and does these things that no one has an interest in. They don't want to engage violinists to do this kind of stuff. But for the piano, that's certainly not one of my favorite works. Other questions, comments? Everybody hungry, thirsty? Okay, well...
Just a second.
Yes.
The artist of this evening is not with us tonight. Can you tell us anything about her inspiration? And while the music was playing, I was looking at these pieces, and what would she have thought of when she painted them?
Well, I would not ever deign to speak for Marianne. I'm sure she would take me to task if I tried to do that. She created these paintings in response to some ideas I told her about Delius, but to the music. I sent her several orchestral excerpts, and this is what she came up with. Now, she's read a draft of what I was going to say as well, but these paintings came before my comments. These are really based on Delius's music. This all grew out of really my work with Scriabin, where he tried to unite all the arts together. The visual arts, his mysterium, the verbal arts, the musical arts. And I like that kind of collaborative approach, that we have something to look at in response to the music. We have the live music. We have a few words from me and others, maybe more than a few. To me, this is exhilarating, and this represents an outgrowth of the work on Scriabin. But also, I think this is a culmination of something for me. The profound, contemplative, visionary nature of Delius calls to my soul. Well, I think I am going to invite Elena and Daniel to play a surprise encore. And then afterwards, we will go straight upstairs and have food and beverages. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. Thank you so much. And I'd like to dedicate this evening, such as it is, to my family members who've supported me for so long. Thank you.
Pablo Sarasate, Caprice, Basque.